if you are a producer of steel, aluminium, cement, hydrogen, electricity, or downstream products of steel, such as steel nails, it's time to reassess your production processes. Starting 2023, the European Union is going to adopt a carbon border adjustment mechanism, or for short, CBAM, which is going to make your export sales to the European Union more expensive unless if you adopt greener practices. Starting October 2023, the importers of your products would be required to submit a quarterly basis analysis which will contain details of the imports and the carbon emission emitted in these products. And from 2026, importers will be required to purchase CBAM certificates to import your products. CBAM certificates is nothing but essentially the cost of greenhouse gases and the emissions produced during the manufacturing process of your products. The CBAM will not make your export sales not only more expensive, but will also increase the compliance burden on you and the importer in the European Union. In order to break this down, ELP is starting a video series on the CBAM, which will bring in the legal and the economic experts to help you understand when, how, and why of CBAM. Hi, this is Sanjay Notani, Senior Partner of the International Trade and Customs Practice at ELP. You are tuned into episode 1 of ELP's Trade Dialogue. Through a 3-episode series, the ELP Dialogue will take you through the multiple aspects and facets of the CBAM regulation, the impact it would have on Indian businesses, and what steps should businesses and governments take in the light of this new age law. Today, we will also understand what the CBAM regulation is, what are the policy motivations behind the introduction of such a law, and its geopolitical and diplomatical repercussions on this regulation and on all of us. To help us unpack the CBAM regulation, we have with us today Arnoud Willems. Arnold is a partner of International Commercial and Trade Practice Group in the Brussels office of Baker & McKenzie. He has an extensive network built over 25 years as a trusted advisor of entrepreneurs, executives, and diplomats. Arnold has a deep understanding of how trade rules and shapes in terms of global flows of capital, investment, goods, technology, and services. Over to you, Arnold. It is a pleasure to have you here with us today on the CBAM series.
Yes, thank you for having me, Sanjay. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
So before we move into more technical questions, could you throw us some light on what the CBAM regulation is? What is the political and economic background in which it has been introduced?
Yes, it's quite something. But before really going into detail, what is CBAM exactly? I would like to go back a couple of years, since that will help understanding the situation. Basically, in 2005, the European Union introduced its emission trading system, mostly referred to as ETS. And this ETS forces companies to buy certificates based on their emissions. And the price of these certificates is set by the market. So said differently, the price is set by supply and demand and can vary. So the prices have fluctuated between 5 euros, I think, yes, and 120 euros per ton of CO2 emitted. So a big difference. And EU companies have increasingly thought to circumvent this emission trading system. And they have done so in 2 ways. And the first way was to relocate their manufacturing activities to jurisdictions located outside the territory covered by the EU emission trading system. And the second way was that EU-based companies increasingly started purchasing and importing goods covered by the European emission trading system, which has been manufactured outside of its territorial scope. And this phenomenon, those 2 points together, basically are referred to as carbon leakage. And the CBAM basically aims to tackle this issue of carbon leakage. It will do this by forcing importers of certain goods to pay a price for their carbon emissions. And this price reflects the price that is paid by the European producers under the emission trading system. Politically, the CBAM fits with the Europeans' ambitions to have very strict environmental policies. The CBAM, however, is quite a controversial policy and has not been proven very popular. It has been discussed already for years, a little bit informally though, before it actually gained traction. In 2019, when the new European Commission entered into power, there was a new momentum for this CBAM initiative, and the new president of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, presented the European Green Deal, and the Green Deal really included this CBAM as part of it. The aim of CBAM is really to protect the European industry from the negative impact that the environmental policy of the EU basically has on its own internal market. And one of these damaging policies is the European trading system.
So that was very insightful. Thank you. Moving on to the mechanics of CBAM regulation, we understand that the CBAM regulation is going to be introduced in 3 phases. In the first phase, starting October 2023, importers are required to file quarterly reports regarding the carbon emissions in the products imported by them. In some time of 2026, it's really when the impact of CBAM is expected to hit the importers and exporters, since that's when the importers and will have to start purchasing CBAM certificates. Could you please explain to our listeners why should the exporters be concerned, and also what are the consequences of non-cooperation would have to be borne by both the exporters and importers, especially from countries such as India?
Yes, that's a good point, Sanjay. There's indeed a lot of consequences for companies that don't comply. But first, let me clarify basically that not all products will be covered by the CBAM. It's not covering all European imports. It's just limited to certain sectors. It's the iron and steel sector, it's the aluminium sector, the cement sector, the fertilizer sector, chemicals, and electricity. So exporters covered by CBAM should basically be concerned for 3 reasons, I think. First, they may be required by their customers to consume the cost, or to carry the cost basically of the CBAM charge. This could be by changing the price of the product or by somehow providing a rebate. And the second reason is that the introduction of the CBAM may basically deter the imports. It may become less interesting to import products that are subject to CBAM duties. So this may also decrease the demand. And finally, if the importer is a European subsidiary of an exporter, the cost of paying the CBAM charge will ultimately be borne by the group itself. The CBAM charge as such is linked to the carbon price under the emission trading system. And basically what you see is that over the past years, the price of the trading credits have increased 5-fold over the past years. And recently they have even exceeded the 100 euro per ton mark. So therefore the cost burden for everyone is quite significant.
And
so,
what about the non-cooperation?
So under CBAM, importers of goods are basically subject to 2 obligations. First, they have to surrender CBAM certificates to pay for the greenhouse gases emitted in the production of their products. And second, they have to register to become an authorized importer of CBAM related products. And if you don't comply with the rules, the EU will impose penalties. And basically there are 2 scenarios. Suppose an importer fails to surrender the required CBAM certificates by the deadline, which is the 31st of March every year. And the penalty for this is basically identical to the penalties under the emission trading system for failure to surrender emission trading allowances. That means, say, $100 per ton of CO2 emitted for which the operator has failed to surrender the CBAM certificates. And in addition, the company still has to purchase the entire amount of these certificates. So that's not good. And then you have scenario 2, when the importer is not registered and still imports. In this case, the penalty is even steeper. The penalty is really between 3 and 5 times the penalty referred to in the previous scenario. So that's even worse. So registering is really important. And then you have basically a third thing that's interesting to mention, I think. There may be companies that circumvent CBAM intentionally or unintentionally. They may modify the imported product or change its CN code to try to avoid the CBAM charge, or they may be splitting shipments into consignments to make sure that the threshold of CBAM requirements is not made, and that may give even rise to higher penalties, including criminal sanctions.
So clearly, I think we'll have to wait and watch how these new circumvention regulations and rules may be applied principally and otherwise, as opposed to today, what we have circumvention under the trade remedial regulations under the WTO. But looks clearly that the exporters may have a lot to lose if they do not take the CBAM regulation seriously. And we also understand that clearly today, based on current export numbers, sectors which would be affected clearly from India at this point in time are the steel and aluminum sectors. And clearly, we will have to sort of consider these sectors much more closely and provide some advice to them. What would you give to individual companies as well as the sectors at large to comply with the CBAM, and what should companies be doing, particularly on the procedural issues, which remains somewhat very, very unclear?
Yes. Yeah, in the short term, I think there's not that much choice. Companies that want to continue doing business with the EU, they basically have to comply. So what they need to do is really study the rules carefully and see whether they can minimize the impact somehow. Yeah. But as a second step, the key is to really know how the emissions will be calculated. And the European Commission at this moment is working on an implementing act, exactly trying to push out rules to determine how to calculate the emissions. Yeah. The aim is to publish this act by October this year, and I would really recommend that companies engage with the European Commission on those calculations. And they can do this directly as Indian company. They can work together with their customer in the EU. They can work with the Indian government. They can work with an association in India or in Europe. But they have to make their voice known, and they have to explain to the European Commission basically what it really means. Because don't forget, those European Commission officials, they are not businessmen. They are not having to produce steel or aluminium or chemicals. They are just regulators. They don't know everything. And then there's, of course, the third step next to complying and trying to engage in the system. And the third step is really that you could consider to challenge CBAM in front of courts. And if that works, it could be a very interesting option, because that means that the CBAM will be annulled altogether. And then you can say, yeah, but why would I do that as an individual company? Because I would do the work for all the other companies. True, but at the end of the day, you would end up without a CBAM. But there is one interesting point for companies that really take the action themselves. They, and only they, will be able to get back in time and claim back the CBAM price they have paid so far. So that is a big incentive, I would say.
Absolutely, and I think that makes a lot of sense. So then, how do you think that companies can cooperate and jointly address the expected impact from CBAM? And what would your suggestions to a country like India be, given the enormous capacity which India is investing in research and development, as well as increasing inclination towards renewable energy to also meet the Paris climate deadlines?
Yes, yeah, also a good question. Well, I think the first thing is to look into the technical side. I think India has tremendous capacities in R&D, and they should really try to work together with the EU on greening the world, but also in trying to gain a competitive advantage on the domestic market compared to other countries that are importing into the EU. You know, if you're doing better, you will be paying less for your emissions. Yeah? But yeah, that's of course a little bit long term. You also need to have a short term solution. And there, probably one of the best things to do is to try to convince the Indian government to also implement some type of an ETS. Because if there is a parallel ETS system in India, you may get, or you will get, I should say, a discount on the price of the emissions you will have to pay upon import in the EU. And in the meantime, you know, what I said before, you should focus on compliance. You should really work on a system to calculate the embedded emissions in your product. You should register your company according to the rules of the EU, liaise with your importers and clients to use their authorization and to find also someone that can help you confirm your calculations. That's an accredited verifier, and that can basically confirm that the embedded emissions you have calculated are correct. So that is the compliance part. And then I think it's also good to make some type of an impact assessment, how this CBAM will really affect you going forward, because that will determine a little bit your strategy in other areas later on in the longer term. And then you really need to keep your ears to the ground. You need to really track the developments. I mentioned already that the EU is now working on the implementation of the CBAM regulation. You want to engage, and that will determine this. The EU is basically now busy. Okay, what will be the default value? How do we calculate it? So it's important to be aware of what is happening and to make your voice heard.
Thanks, and I agree with you. Nevertheless, that it's going to be quite a tedious, both for the regulator as well as the exporters and importers and all the stakeholders, including trade lawyers such as us, to see how in the coming days how this will evolve. So it's interesting that you mentioned the introduction of a parallel Indian ETS. Could you please throw some light on that? Could you also elaborate on what it would mean for a trading system to be linked with the EU ETS, and how countries can design their trading systems to be eligible to be linked with the EU ETS, given that India is already on the road to not only making a policy, but coming out with an Indian ETS very, very soon in terms of the carbon trading mechanism for India?
Yeah, I heard something in the grapevine about this indeed. But in general, I think the CBAM aims to basically ensure an equivalent carbon pricing between EU goods and imported goods. And, you know, that means they have to find a way to level the playing field on one hand, but also to be fair. And therefore, the CBAM includes basically two mechanisms: one, an exemption, and the other one is a rebate. And if we are looking at an exemption, which basically can be a discount, if you can call it that way, on the price you would have to pay. So that means that if there is a country where that has its own emission trading system, preferably also with a market-based system, you already pay something in that country for your emissions. Then it would not be fair, of course, if you have to pay upon import, if you have to pay again. So what happens then is that the European Commission will say, okay, if you already paid, say, 50 in your own country, if the price in the EU is 100, then you only have to pay 50 upon import in the EU. So that is basically how the exemption will work. And then if you go to the second system, it's basically a rebate. And in that case, the importer can claim a reduction of the CBAM certificates it's need to surrender to take into account the price already paid in the country of production. And that's basically the example I already gave before.
So quite interesting that if the carbon emitted during production is already paid for in a way, then the CBAM regulation will not make the exporter pay again. Clearly, a lot of auditing and auditor rules, including all the processes will have to be in sync to sort of tally all the records in order to sort of claim that benefit. That's going to be quite an interesting thing. That leads me, of course, to the next question. India, of course, now continues to oppose the introduction of the CBAM regulation at various forums, including the WTO. From a policy perspective, how does the CBAM tie in with the EU's international obligation under the Paris Climate and the WTO?
Yes, that's quite something. So basically, the EU, of course, wants to make it all its regulation WTO compliant, and that's what they will always say that. So they will never say that they don't comply, because their policy is to comply with the WTO rules. But if you look at the CBAM, basically, okay, there is this level playing field issue, but the second part that is driving this initiative is really the Paris Agreement. And then the question is, of course, yes, how are you going to achieve the goals of this Paris Agreement? Well, the EU has basically chosen to take this emission trading system, and that it should be a market-based system. But yeah, then they designed this CBAM, and then the question is whether it will indeed pass the test, pass the WTO test. And then I think there may be a couple of points that that will come under scrutiny in the coming years, or the coming months even already. And the first is basically that the system has to be non-discriminatory. The EU system cannot discriminate between producers in foreign countries. So by treating imports from countries with a similar system as the EU, the ETS basically can quickly discriminate. So that's the first point, no discrimination. You know? The second point is basically that the EU will probably say that, yeah, but we are basing ourselves on the Paris Agreement, so we apply for the exception for the environment, and that allows us to take discriminatory measures. Well, that's true, but on the other hand, the big question is whether they meet all the requirements to apply or to rely on this environmental exception. So let's see. And the third will basically be to, you know, the third point of the EU will basically say, look, we want this Paris Agreement to be effective, and we give it hand and foot, and this is a way to enforce the rules of this Paris Agreement. But then we are here in the trade environment, and we should not forget that to reach the aims of the Paris Agreement can be done in different ways. So you can impose a direct tax, you can impose a technological requirement that limits emissions, and then you can, like the EU did, impose a market-based system. And all systems will result in the same effect, reaching the climate change agreement or the Paris Agreement climate change goals. And by now really imposing this market-based system, you may argue that what the EU is doing is not the least trade distortive way, and is basically an over-regulation. So let's see what the WTO judges at a certain moment will rule about this. And then the second part, or the last part, I should say, and we don't know this yet, the devil of all those rules is normally in the details. And as I already mentioned, the EU is now working on the implementation of the CBAM rules. And then it has to apply all those rules. So the question is whether the implementation rules and the application of all the rules will be done in a WTO consistent manner. So we will see. It's exciting times ahead, I would say.
So yes, you're absolutely right. What you mentioned, that the devil does lie in the detail, and it will be interesting to see that how trade lawyers, global trade lawyers, sit at the WTO and interpret this at the WTO. So as you may know, Arnoud, India has, of course, undertaken very, very ambitious commitments regarding climate change at various international forums. Thus, even as India registers its protest against the CBAM regulations, it is also looking very, very clearly to adapt simultaneously to the greening of supply chains And both India and the EU also have been looking to deepen their relationship, most notably through a possible FTA. Surely we don't know the timelines of that and when will we conclude. But what my question is that can we expect that an FTA between India and EU would be able to address some of India's issues with the CBAM regulation?
Yeah, the FTA, that's a great idea. It's really an interesting approach, I think, because indeed, within an FTA, the countries, India and the EU, they can negotiate and arrange whatever they want. Yeah. So what India could do is say, look, I'm happy to conclude an FTA with you, EU, but there's one condition we want you to meet. We want basically a waiver from the CBAM rules, and otherwise there's no FTA. Let's see how the EU will react. The EU will probably say, yeah, but then you have to meet a couple of requirements. But then India says, yeah, but we already have our ETS, so let's just call it equivalent, and let's see. For the EU side, it will be interesting as well because they will be very afraid of the precedent something like this will give. But it would be a fair point to make during the FTA negotiations. But in the whole FTA negotiations, that's of course quite a tall order because it's very broad. What I'm thinking is that perhaps you could even have a better shot at arranging something in what I would call a topical agreement. You have at this moment, you have many topical agreements on, for instance, e-commerce or digital trade. And why would you not have a topical agreement on just on climate change or on CBAM? And that could be an interesting move where you could basically say, look, as long as we are on track as India with our Paris Agreement obligations, we are free from your CBAM rules. Good work, good work. They should try.
So clearly, I completely agree that topical agreement would be one of the out-of-box thinking that India can clearly think of and test it out with the EU. But finally leads me to the last question. Then from a policy and an advocacy perspective, how should you see that government sectors and companies address the issues of CBAM? And how can countries such as India comply with and gain from a regulation such as CBAM?
Yeah, that's not easy. Being the best in class and comply is always difficult. It's the easiest option, but at least the most obvious option, but it's of course a very difficult option. But it will make complying, will make Indian products more expensive on the European market. Because, you know, I don't believe that from the start, all the Indian companies will fall under the exception or under the rebate. Because therefore, yeah, it will in the short term really mean Indian products will become a bit more expensive. But at the end of the day, if you think about rules like CBAM, they are very disruptive, and then there are basically three basic reactions that most people or most governments or companies have. The first is, yeah, you know, we disagree, we don't like this, and we are an honorable country, so we take the royal route and we go to the WTO and we challenge this. Now, problem with this approach, it's a very valid approach, it's a gentleman approach, but it will take a couple of years, and in those years you will still have to comply. So that's not so easy. The second option, the second option that many countries will pursue is basically you try to befriend the EU. We discussed that a little bit. You become best friends. You try to get an exception. You conclude an FTA where you say the rules don't apply to us. Basically, good work, good work. And the third way, basically, is to do the same as the EU does. You know, you impose also a CBAM type of system, so that the EU also has EU imports in India also have to pay some type of a charge. That way you level the playing field, at least between the two blocks. But it's of course not the most efficient solution, but it may work in the short term. So I guess that quite a lot of countries will be considering basically copying the European CBAM regulation. And I don't know whether that is in the interest of the broader world, or if that is something that the EU really envisaged or wanted with this regulation.
So that brings us to the end of the podcast. Thank you, Arnoud. It's been a pleasure to have you on our opening podcast series, and look forward to working with you and the team at B&M on this and many other issues.